Assalamu alaikum. The lecture 26 continues the request and responses topic from the previous lectures, and the further details about the request response lifecycle will be discussed along with some characteristics of the request object and the response object. So if you look at the typical request life cycle, that every request, whether it is a HTTP or another form of request coming into a browser across layers, is converted into a request object. The application then generates the response object, which is sent back out across the layers to the user. So this diagram typically shows the request response mechanism in PHP Laravel framework. The user at the start of this process generates a request from the browser, which is passed through the application's middleware, and a response is generated, which actually again passes through middleware to send back to the user. So in Laravel, the configuration captures the request regardless of the URL and route it to the index.php or public.index.php, which has three primary functions. First of all, it loads the composer's autoload file, which registers all the composer-based dependencies which are required to run the application or for particular request. Secondly, it kickstarts the Bootstrap program, loading the core services such as kernel. You can find these kernels available in the app folder of your applications. And finally, it creates a kernel instance, creating a request using the user's web request, and then it passes to kernel to handle it, which generates the response and ends the request which was generated by the user. So if you look at the kernel is the core router for every application. It is responsible to receive the request, pass it through the middleware, handle the exceptions, pass it to the page router, and then passing back the response. So kernel is responsible for number of operations. In Laravel, there are two kernels or specific, one handling the HTTP request named as HTTP kernel, while other handles the console command named as console kernels. So each has a handle method to handle the request and return the response to the user. The kernel is responsible to run all the bootstrap before processing a request and running all the service providers. The service providers are also located in the main folder of your app, referred as app, and it can be found into the service provider file or service provider folder if there are more than one service provider are linked to your application. The HTTP kernel additionally defines list of middlewares such as authentication or CRSF protection that wrap each request, including the core middleware responsible for sessions in which you store the data of your user, and CSRF protection for handling the form request to actually filter out the code sent by the user. So as I explained earlier in the previous slide, that there can be more than one service provider, which you can find into the app/service provider folder. So most of the bootstrap code is separated into service providers. A service provider is a class that encapsulates the logic that various parts of your application need to run in order to bootstrap the core functionality. So one of the common example of a service provider is authentication service provider, which is necessary for bootstrapping Laravel authentication. If there is no service provider, no authentication bootstrapping is applicable in your application. Another common service provider is the root service provider, and it is necessary for bootstrapping Laravel routing. So any code that needs to run in preparation for the application code to run, it is a strong candidate for a service provider. So providers have a register method that binds the class to the containers. Do not do anything in these methods that relies on the entire application bootstrapping. So any changes in this method will result in the bootstrapping of all of your application, which will eventually relieve all of the processes and the data held by the user at any time. Provider has a boot method that bootstraps the application, like binding event listener or defining routes. Anything that relies on the entire application to be bootstrapped. So let's move our discussion to the request object. As explained in the previous few lectures, the request object intends to represent every possible information a request can carry in a single object. The following information can be extracted from the request input method. So few of the method has been discussed earlier. One of example is request all method, which returns an array of all user provided input. You can also find out a simple input from one or more fields by calling the request input method and specifying the name of the field. The only method allows only fields, and the accept method allows all the fields except provided in the field name attribute. Exist is a very useful method and returns a boolean indicating that whether a field exists in the input, and has is similar to the exist method. So field refers to a method or a boolean value that indicates whether the field exists in the input is not empty or it has some value. The other two methods which we'll use in next few lectures are JSON and JSON with the key name. The first method returns a parameter bag if the page had JSON sent to it. Similarly, next method returns the value of a given key from the JSON sent to the page. So there are some input that is directly not provided from the forms, which can also be part of the request object, and it represents the state and the user information of your application. So one of the simplest method which we discussed in the previous lecture is the method of the request object. It returns the HTTP method such as get, post, patch used to access this route. Similarly, you can extract the information of the path from the request object using the path method, and it will return a path from your URL. Similarly, if you want to access the whole URL of your request, you can access the URL method of the request. The is method returns a boolean indicating that whether or not the current page request fuzzy matches, such as provided string on the path such as /a/b/c would be matched by request is the static. That means anything can happen in the URL. It should only contain the letter B, or you can use any other custom regular expression parser. Simply, IP method returns a user IP address. Header returns an array of headers, or if passed to a header name as a parameter, returns just that header. Simply, server returns an array of the variable traditionally stored in $server, or if passed a $server variable name, it returns just that value. Secure checks that whether the page was loaded with the HTTPS rather than HTTP. PJAX returns a boolean indicating that the page request was loaded with the pgex, and wants JSON and is JSON returns boolean indicating that whether the request has any JSON content, and in the same case is JSON returns a boolean indicating that whether request has any JSON content in type of content type header. Accept returns a boolean indicating whether the change request accepts a given content type. Similarly, you can access files and other persistent information from your request object. Files inputs are similarly to the explicit inputs but handled differently. The request can also interact with the sessions to maintain the persistence. Most of the sessions lives everywhere, however, falling over some of the functions that you can work with the session. So one of the common function is the flash, and it flashes the current request user input to the session to be retrieved later, which means it's saved for the session but it disappears after the next request. So if you want to display some messages to the user for some or one request, you can use the flash message. Similarly, flash only flashes the current user request input for any keys provided in the array. Flash except uses the same mechanism, and it flashes the current user request input except for any key provided in the array. Old returns an array for our previously flashed user input, or if passed a key returns the value of the key if it was previously flashed. Flush wipes out the previously flashed information from the user input. Similarly, cookie and has cookie have their particular usage. Retrieves all the cookies information. If you want to collect the cookies, you can use the cookie method, and if you want to check the specific cookie, you can check the has cookie. So these three methods allow you to deal with the files. The first one is the file, and it returns all the uploaded files, and if you specify the key, it will select only one file. All files is similar to the files, and it returns the array of uploaded files. And has file is very useful method to check that whether the file was uploaded at any specified key. When you are done with the request object, the next thing is to generate responses. So PHP Laravel also provides you a number of ways to create responses in different objects and in different mediums. The response object represents the response sent to the user, complete with header, cookies, content, and anything else sent along, such as files, pages, etc. So any response returned from the root definition will be converted to HTTP response. So this is a simple way to send a simple hello response back to the user. So whenever the user access the root of your root, you want to send a hello back to the user. The next step shows the similar mechanism to get the root, and in this way the response is attached with some header name and a header value, and along with a cookie name and a cookie value, you can specify any of the values at these placeholders. So you can also send a view or a file into the response, and if you need to customize the header, HTTP status, or anything else when returning the view, a view method along with its response can be used. So on the other hand, if you need a user browser to download a file, the download method makes it simple. The required parameter is path. Optional parameters are file name to be saved as, or any headers. So if you look at the first example, you get a root URL and you have the HTML getter service. And in the response, you create a view named as XML structure and pass it with the data which you get from the XML getter service. and embed it with the header of content type, and the type of the content will be text or XML. Similarly, if you want to send the files to the user, you can generate the response with the download method and specify the file name, and optional parameters are specified here, or simply one file name will do the fine. You can also send files or JSON objects to the response. The file response is similar to the download response, except it allows browser to display the file rather than download. As you can see, in most of the images and PDFs, the file is not downloaded, or rather it is displayed into the browser. So if you want to use such kind of mechanism, you can use this type of uh, response. In this way, the response type is file, and you have specified the invoices slash optional ID parameter PDF file with the header, and in this case it will be displayed in the browser. On the other hand, if you want the JSON responses, it will convert the past data to JSON and set the content type to application JSON. So this is a simple example. In this case, you have generated a response with the JSON format, and you have passed on the all of the context, and it will convert into a JSON format. Similarly, this is also same method. It is embedded with the callback method, and it requires some input callback. So you can also redirect users to some other pages as a response to some request. Redirects are different from other responses. Redirects return from the application, often send the user to another location in the application. Technically, you can use response.redirect method, but more specifically, redirect helper is used. So redirect is directly used, or redirect.to method works same. Redirect back can also be useful for validating the input and sending back. So these are the simple redirect or redirect methods, and the information provided is the root name or the root parameter of the controller and the method. Similarly, if you want to redirect some other website, you can use the redirect.away method, or if you want to use a specific to a specific resource, you can use the redirect.route method or the redirect.action method. And if you want to send some information, if the input validation fails, you can use the redirect back method with inputs. This also shows the same process, but it redirects to a dashboard page with some message and contact created information. And finally, if you want to simply show some message, you can echo a message to a session, and you can use the session variable into the blade templates to view your input message. You can also generate custom responses using the custom macros, and you can use these custom macros in a custom service provider or an app service provider. Such as in this case, we have created an app service provider macro into the boot method, and we have generated a response with a macro named myJSON, and we have converted this to a JSON encode method with headers, and the type of the content is specified as the JSON. Then it can be used anywhere into the application, such as you can use response, and the name of the macros is used if you specify it into the custom service provider or app service provider, along with the information, such as in this case we have provided a null value with the name. That is end about the response and request lifecycle. If you want to study more about the topic, you can read chapter number 10. Thank you very much.